with markets surging and oil prices plunging after President Trump walked back from the brink of his threat to destroy Iranian civilization, announcing an 11th-hour ceasefire agreement between the U.S. and Iran, although the details of that agreement remain clouded in contradictory statements between the two sides. And there is real uncertainty over whether that 14-day truce will actually hold. Yesterday, President Trump announced on social media what he called a double-sided ceasefire, and that the bombing would cease subject to Iran's complete, immediate, and safe opening of the Strait of Hormuz. The president also saying the U.S. received a 10-point proposal from Iran that he deemed workable, although he did not provide further details about it. Iran's Security Council calling the ceasefire a victory against American aggression. These were the scenes in Iran overnight as pro-government demonstrators celebrated, chanting in the streets while burning the U.S. and Israeli flags. Vice President Vance touting the deal this morning while acknowledging the ceasefire is on shaky ground. And moments ago saying if Iran breaks the bargain, they're going to see serious consequences. Meanwhile, the president saying in an interview today that the ceasefire was, quote, a total and complete victory for the U.S., which Defense Secretary Hegseth then echoed hours later.
Operation Epic Fury was a historic and overwhelming victory on the battlefield. A capital V military victory. By any measure, Epic Fury decimated Iran's military and rendered it combat ineffective for years to come. President Trump had the power to cripple Iran's entire economy in minutes. But he chose mercy. He spared those targets because Iran accepted the ceasefire under overwhelming pressure. We'll be hanging around. We're not going anywhere. We're going to make sure Iran complies with this ceasefire and then ultimately comes to the table and makes a deal. So we'll stay put, stay ready, stay vigilant. As the chairman laid out, our troops are prepared to defend, prepared to go on offense, prepared to restart at a moment's notice.
But the tenuous nature of the truce is on full display right now, with Iran's parliamentary speaker claiming that multiple points of the deal have been violated, and White House Press Secretary Carrie Leavitt telling reporters that Iran's public announcement is about the agreement cannot be trusted.
The Iranians originally put forward a 10-point plan that was fundamentally unserious, unacceptable, and completely discarded. It was literally thrown in the garbage by President Trump and his negotiating team. The regime acknowledged reality to the negotiating team. They put forward a more reasonable and entirely different and condensed plan to the president and his team. President Trump and the team determined the new modified plan was a workable basis on which to negotiate and to align it with our own 15-point proposal. The president's red lines, namely the end of Iranian enrichment in Iran, have not changed. And the idea that President Trump would ever accept an Iranian wish list as a deal is completely absurd.
The White House, however, providing no details on what is actually being negotiated or agreed to behind closed doors. Moments ago, Vice President Vance speaking to reporters on his way back to Washington from Hungary, also addressing some of the confusion.
There are 3 different 10-point proposals, at least, that I've seen floating around. The first 10-point proposal was something that was submitted, and we think, frankly, was probably written by ChatGPT, that was submitted to Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. That immediately went in the garbage and was rejected. There was a second 10-point proposal that was much more reasonable, that was based on some back and forth between us, between the Pakistanis, and between the Iranians. That is the 10-point proposal that the president was referencing in his truth yesterday. And then, frankly, I've seen a third 10-point proposal that's even more maximalist than the first 10-point proposal that's been floating around various social media channels.
Iran today announcing it was suspending traffic through the Strait of Hormuz, accusing Israel of violating their end of the agreement, after the Israeli military launched another series of attacks on Hezbollah, Iran's proxy in Lebanon. As for the status of the vital waterway for global oil markets, here's some of what Leavitt told my colleague Gabe Gutierrez.
Iranian state media is saying that Iran has now closed off the Strait of Hormuz today in response to Israeli attacks on Lebanon. What's the White House response to that?
The president was made aware of those reports before I came to the podium. That is completely unacceptable. And again, this is a case of what they're saying publicly is different privately. We have seen an uptick of traffic in the Strait today, and I will reiterate the president's expectation and demand that the Strait of Hormuz is reopened immediately quickly and safely. That is his expectation. It has been relayed to him privately that is what's taking place, and these reports publicly are false.
Additionally, it doesn't appear that the ceasefire has actually resulted in the cessation of firing. Qatar's defense ministry says it was targeted today by 7 missiles and drones launched from Iran, and Kuwait saying a number of petroleum facilities and its energy ministry were attacked by Iranian drones. The breakneck pace of developments coming today as Pakistan is planning to host diplomatic talks in Islamabad later this week with the U.S. and Iranian negotiators. The White House saying today Vice President Vance will lead the U.S. delegation, along with Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and the president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner. Joining me now is our team of reporters from all around the world. NBC News White House correspondent Monica Alba, NBC News Chief International Correspondent Keir Simmons is in Saudi Arabia. NBC News International Correspondent Matt Bradley is in Tel Aviv. Also with me are NBC News Senior National Security Correspondent Courtney Kube and NBC News Business and Economy reporter Allie Canal. Thank you all so much for joining us on an incredibly busy news day. Monica, I want to start with you, though, at the White House. Is there any more clarity on what was agreed to as part of this ceasefire deal?
It seems, Mel, that the only agreement here really is to take a bit of a pause to try to establish the possibility of diplomatic talks. But the actual fine points of what might be in this agreement, in these proposals, in this framework is not being revealed. The United States side of it, and you saw the vice president talk about this, is not putting out what the exact plan that is under discussion actually is. We only know that there are certain points in there from what has been floated publicly that the White House is pushing back on, including what it could mean for the potential presence of U.S. service members in the region, what it could mean for the potential of sanctions that could be eased against Iran, and really, in terms of some of the most critical areas of disagreement, what the actual future of how the Strait of Hormuz will be handled, how that is going to be addressed. And it is just simply unclear right now whether any of that has actually been agreed to. You did hear the vice president sort of indicate that maybe on a couple of points there has been some indication there could be cooperation, but there is still a just very tenuous sense, even from the White House today, that these talks could fall apart, that there could be a real issue with trying to solidify or shape up some of the ones that, again, are just going to be extremely thorny, that either from the Iranian perspective they will not accept or that the U.S. won't accept. Mel.
Well, speaking of things that are not clear, there's been so much back and forth over Iran's 10-point plan. President Trump called it workable, but apparently, according to Vance, there's been a couple different ones floating around. Is it clear to you, Monica, exactly what the points are that the U.S. and Iran are actually negotiating here?
And remember that back when Steve Witkoff was the one who did confirm that there was a multi-point plan that had been sent back and forth through intermediaries, that's basically what we know about it. We know that this plan exists, but we have never seen it from the U.S. side of things. What's on the screen right now has been publicized from Iran's Supreme National Security Council, and they point out some of these things that, again, they are likely non-starters for the U.S., including full compensation for damages in Iran, the removal of all sanctions. It does seem some will be eased, but probably not all of them, the release of all frozen Iranian assets, and again, that whole debate over the acceptance of nuclear enrichment, which President Trump has indicated and the White House has indicated is not something that he's going to accept. Mel.
Yeah, such a key sticking point. Vice President Vance is leading the U.S. delegation for talks in Islamabad. The vice president, though, notably was opposed to the U.S. strikes in Iran. So what do you make of his role in this diplomatic effort?
This has been such a fascinating dynamic to watch, exactly for those personal reasons that you just point out, where he has long been opposed to these kinds of extended foreign entanglements. Privately, we know that that is what he told the president. He was the one who was most against this potential action, but then ultimately said to him he would get on board with whatever the president decided. And now he is the one who, it seems, is going to be brought into the negotiations in a role that we haven't seen him play typically. Usually you would see Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner involved in these kind of nitty-gritty discussions about trying to see if there can be progress on the diplomatic path. But the fact that he is going to be going to Pakistan, that he is going to be the highest-ranking U.S. official to visit there in years, is a very, very significant one, because it also carries the risk of whether there isn't any progress that can be achieved there, of looking like he was involved in something that ultimately failed, which we know politically just raises all sorts of questions about what that could mean for his future as a potential 2028 presidential candidate. So just a lot of different layers and a complexity to all of this at home and overseas. Mel.
No doubt. Monica, Alba, thank you. I want to turn now to Keir Simmons, who's overseas for us. Iran is saying that the Strait of Hormuz is closed and claiming that the causes of the ceasefire proposal were violated. But what are you hearing, and what is the status of the ceasefire?
Well, I think it's confusion. You heard the vice president suggest that it's kind of understandable confusion, and that's probably right. Certainly, we spoke just in the past hour to a former IRGC commander in Tehran about the perspective from there, and he was suggesting that the Iranian regime is prepared to negotiate, that it does consider the points that it put forward as a starting point, if you like, and that it doesn't expect to win all of those. You know, there are so many that would be so advantageous to the Iranian regime that they would be happy, you might think, with just some of them. For example, sanctions being lifted, or having more control over the Strait of Hormuz, or even, and it's just impossible to imagine that the US would agree to this, but even, you know, US personnel, US military being removed from the Arab world, where I am now. I'm now in Saudi Arabia. But on the other hand, he did say that these attacks in Lebanon, which I think you'll talk to Matt a bit more about in a moment, that they are really a red line for Iran, and that perhaps even the talks won't take place, that they would call them off if that continues. So, I mean, it is a delicate tightrope walk right now, I think, on both sides, not least because in Iran there will be different factions with different views about how far the Iranians should compromise. And then, of course, just to finish there are the US allies and partners in this region. I'm in Saudi Arabia, in a part of Saudi Arabia where they have been bombarded. Bahrain is just across the water there in the Gulf. Again, they've been bombarded, and there was real frustration in the Arab world that there were more attacks today, even after this ceasefire was called.
Well, part of Iran's initial 10-point plan includes Iranian control over the Strait of Hormuz. What would be the implications for the region if Iran is able to control toll vessels passing through the strait?
They're not going to like it. I mean, to be honest, it's frankly unacceptable to governments like Saudi Arabia, many of these Gulf governments. And I do think that there are signs that that's not the way that it will play out. And just as an example, it's worth remembering that Saudi Arabia, for example, has oil deals with China, and China has a lot of leverage over Iran. And so the idea that oil for China might have to be paid for, you might have to pay the Iranians in order to have that transported to Asia. That seems difficult to comprehend, honestly. But I think that just illustrates another point here, which is that we haven't talked very much about China's role, Beijing's role in all of this. But certainly it's been suggested in the last 24 hours that Beijing did have a role in putting pressure on Iran. And that, I think, is significant in terms of the balance of power in this region. Maybe just a small shift, but an important one.
Yeah, Keir, thank you so much for all of that really important perspective. Matt, I want to turn to you, and I want to start by playing something that Vice President Vance said today about Israel's attacks on Lebanon. Let's play it, and we'll talk about it on the other side.
I think the Iranians thought that the ceasefire included Lebanon, and it just didn't. We never made that promise. We never indicated that was going to be the case. What we said is that the ceasefire would be focused on Iran, and the ceasefire would be focused on America's allies, both Israel and the Gulf Arab states. Now, that said, the Israelis, as I understand it, again, I'm supposed to get a fuller report when I get on the plane, have actually offered to be, frankly, to check themselves a little bit in Lebanon because they want to make sure that our negotiation is successful.
Matt, what is the mood like in Tel Aviv right now, and what more do we know about Israel's involvement in this ceasefire deal coming together?
Well, I would say the Tel Aviv mood is really great right now. We're starting to see everybody really going back onto the streets. I'm not going to lie to you. The streets have more or less been filled with people for the past month. I mean, this was a major disaster for Israelis, but there were people going about their business, and increasingly so in the last couple of weeks. But now we're hearing from the Israeli government that more and more security restrictions are going to start to lift. More and more planes are going to start going in and out of Tel Aviv's Ben Gurion Airport. So things here really are starting to get back to normal, and there is quite a bit of optimism around what we're seeing here. Now, as far as this negotiations are concerned, as far as the diplomacy is concerned, the Israeli government is clearly very worried about the progress of this ceasefire. And the issue of Lebanon, as we've been discussing this whole time, is a very vexing one, and one that really does threaten to undermine everything that's been done so far in terms of securing some sort of region-wide peace. Now, the Israelis have said for weeks that they are determined to destroy Hezbollah once and for all. Hezbollah, of course, its main benefactor is Iran. Hezbollah is Iran's cat's paw against Israel, and as such, they are tethered together ideologically, politically, diplomatically. It's the Israelis who have been trying to say, we are trying to decouple Lebanon and Hezbollah from Iran so that we can negotiate and make something like peace with Iran, while at the same time continuing our offensive against Hezbollah. That is about to cause major problems, and already has, for the progress and the future of this negotiated truce.
Matt, thank you so much. We appreciate all of your reporting and analysis. I want to turn to Courtney, who's here on set with me. Courtney, Secretary Hegseth declared victory today. So does the Pentagon view this war as over?
I mean, it sure sounded like it today. And I mean, the two biggest indicators were the comments that we were getting out of Secretary Hegseth today, talking about it being, over, and talking about the tremendous victory here. But I was also really struck by the amount of detail that we got on the battle damage that the U.S. has inflicted on Iran's conventional military by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Dan Kane. For the last 5+ weeks, we've been asking for these kinds of stats. And the answer is always, we're not going to talk about it during the conflict. We don't want to let Iran know that we know what we've hit, and we have an idea of the battle damage. And today he rattled off a number of statistics. To me, that is one of the biggest indicators that that's where they think this is going, is potentially the end. But the reality is, even the statistics they gave prove that the number one objective, military objective, that President Trump spoke about that very first night this started, and that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs talked about today at that briefing, that is to destroy Iran's ballistic missile and drone capabilities. What is very clear is they've not done that. And that is not because they haven't taken out a tremendous amount of that capability, but it's an almost impossible mission. They have also destroyed much of their ability to produce new missiles and produce new drones. But the idea that they have completely destroyed those two capabilities, it's just not true.
And speaking of impossible, difficult missions, I do want to play something that Hegseth said about Iran's enriched uranium.
And so right now it's buried and we're watching it. We know exactly what they have, and they know that. And they will either give it to us, which the president has laid out. They'll give it to us voluntarily. We'll get it. We'll take it out. Or if we have to do something else ourselves, like we did in Midnight Hammer or something like that, we reserve that opportunity.
And Courtney, I know we've talked about this before, but remind us, what would it take for the U.S. to actually take Iran's enriched uranium?
So, I mean, the reference to Midnight Hammer would indicate more big strikes, right? Trying to destroy the facilities with airstrikes. The idea of sending boots on the ground, though, I mean, the U.S. military has plans to go into all of those facilities and try to retrieve that uranium, but it is an enormous logistical undertaking. It would take potentially thousands of U.S. troops. If you're talking about these facilities that were struck during Midnight Hammer, many of them have to be dug out. It's not really clear the state of the uranium either. The IAEA believes that at least half, if not more, is at Isfahan. So it was badly damaged in those strikes. Is it possible that when the facility itself was collapsing down and these canisters were down 100 meters or whatever below, that they were punctured, that they may have been compromised? So you would need to have scientists there who would be able to ensure that there was not a leak of radiation. You would need to have people who would ensure that they're getting the right uranium and not the 20% enriched, and then getting out over 400 kilograms of uranium, even in these canisters, which are about the size of a scuba tank, so very accessible to carry, but there's a lot of them. That's also a huge undertaking. And by the way, you're doing all of this while you're under fire potentially by the Iranians, unless this is some kind of a coordinated thing. It does harken back to something that the U.S. military did in Kazakhstan. It must have been 30 years ago now, in the 1990s. In that case, it was with coordination of the government there, and it still took a month to do.
I think the other big question that everyone has right now is what happens if at the end of these 2 weeks there is no meaningful progress on these negotiations? Does that mean more military action?
Yeah, and then I'll even add to that, what happens if the ceasefire is not holding? And if some of these earliest terms aren't holding? And the reality is the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs were very straightforward about how they are not moving any of the military at this point who have been sent into the region, tens of thousands of troops. They are still there. They're not going anywhere. I could see a possibility where they are all staying there for the next couple of weeks, maybe hopefully getting a little bit of rest because it's been a busy few weeks, but waiting to see what happens here and then maintaining that possibility and that option to restart offensive operations.
Courtney, thank you so much. I know you've been so busy, but we appreciate all the reporting and analysis. I want to turn to Allie because the business side of this has just been such an important storyline. So let's turn to the markets. How are the markets reacting to the ceasefire, and are they being overly optimistic given how fragile this deal seems to be?
Well, if you take a look on your screen there, I mean, what a relief rally on Wall Street. The Dow surging over 1,300 points, the S&P 500 and NASDAQ, both up nearly 3%. A big driver there, oil prices, which plunged today, the largest single-day drop since 2020. Now, are markets getting ahead of themselves? Maybe, but I think investors are just reacting to the fact that this is the first positive piece of news that we've received around this war since it began 6 weeks ago. It was really important that the president focused on the Strait of Hormuz, that critical global choke point. You know that is really the focus here when we look ahead to the future of these negotiations. So that ultimately is what investors are reacting to, and we'll see if these levels can hold.
Well, as you mentioned, oil prices plunged today, but why is that when it's still not entirely clear whether the Strait of Hormuz is actually open?
Yeah, it's interesting here. Markets seem to be pricing out that worst case scenario. So there was this concern that we could see a sustained shutdown of the Strait of Hormuz, which would trigger this global supply shock. We've already seen hints of that already. And if that escalated, you're talking about a real hit to global growth. Now, the ceasefire signals that that may be avoided or at least partially eased. And that's enough to send oil prices lower. But the disconnect here is that for many of these shipping companies, for the insurance agencies, very little has changed from a practical standpoint. So ship traffic through the strait, if you take a look at some of that data, it's just a few ships, basically a trickle at this point. They're not resuming those normal operations. We heard from one major shipping company, Maersk, and they told us in a statement, quote, "The ceasefire may create transit opportunities, but it does not yet provide full maritime certainty, and we need to understand all potential conditions attached. At this point, we take a cautious approach, and we are not making any changes to specific services." So markets are really moving on expectations. We don't have that reality matching just quite yet.
And we'll see how long it takes for gas prices to actually come down. Allie, Canal, thank you. Joining me now is NBC News Chief Foreign Affairs and Chief Washington Correspondent Andrea Mitchell, and Ken Pollack, Vice President for Policy at the Middle East Institute and a former CIA military analyst. Thank you so much for joining us. But Andrea, I do want to start with you. Just give us a reality check in this moment, because the Iranians are throwing cold water on the idea that a ceasefire has actually held, saying it's been violated. So do you think that this is a ceasefire that can actually hold?
This ceasefire is not going to hold. It's going to hold probably for a few days till they all go to Islamabad and have those meetings that will now be led by the vice president. It's interesting to me that if they're talking about the nuclear stockpile, that they are again meeting without having a nuclear expert with them. They don't have Farsi translators. They don't have teams as they did have when we were all covering the negotiations with the Iranians for years in Vienna, in Switzerland, and other areas. Just those extensive, negotiations that led to the agreement, the nuclear agreement. It was a flawed agreement going in because it did not have missiles included, but it did cover for 15 years, limiting the enrichment. And this does not specifically, limit enrichment. The stockpile is supposed to be verified by satellite imagery. Well, it's buried, supposedly obliterated, under these mountains by the actions in last June. So how are they going to verify what's happening underground without having UN inspectors there, and they've not been there since June? I'm not sure how that's possible.
That is going to be such a key question going forward. Ken, what do we know about who's in control in Iran right now, and can a peace deal realistically be negotiated with them?
Sure. So I think this just adds to the kind of skepticism that you just heard from Andrea, which is that it's not entirely clear who's in charge. It does seem to be very much the case that the Revolutionary Guard is in charge enough to be controlling Iran's military forces. Who negotiated this deal, under what circumstances, how much they were actually speaking for a unified Iranian government is entirely unknown. We've heard reports that Mustafa Khamenei, the new supreme leader, is comatose or otherwise incapacitated. We just don't know about any of this. And again, to pick up on the points that Andrea just made, going into this, the Iranian regime is in a completely different place from the Trump administration, right? The way that the two sides are talking about this ceasefire, it's like they're talking about completely different agreements. The amount of overlap is minimal, and I think that it is going to make it that much harder to come to an agreement, A, because the positions are so fundamentally different, but B, because it's not entirely clear who's fully in control in Iran or if anyone is.
There are just so many unknowns at this point. Ken, the White House press secretary did say today that Iran can no longer distribute weapons to its proxies in the region and that Iran will not be able to acquire any more nuclear weapons. But is that how you see it? And have those threats from Iran actually been eliminated?
Well, first, Melanie, how I see it, I think, is irrelevant. I think that all that matters is how the Iranians see it. I think it's very clear the Iranians don't see it that way at all. I don't think they would ever agree to that. I think that if they agreed to it, you could never enforce it, which gets to a number of different problems that we're going to have with this. And again, at the end of the day, the Iranians believe that they have won a great victory. Now, I know the Trump administration believes it has won a great victory. And sometimes it's the case that the best peace deals are when both sides can claim a great victory. The problem that we've got right now is that both sides are so far apart in what they believe they've gotten the other side to do, right? And going into this, we know that the Iranians felt like they had the upper hand, like President Trump was desperate, like the pain that they were taking was less than the pain that they were inflicting on the United States, and particularly on President Trump. That doesn't make for a great agreement.
Andrea, I want to ask about Trump's threat to destroy Iran's civilization. The White House press secretary said today that this was a real threat and that the Pentagon was prepared to follow through with that 8 p.m. deadline. What do you make of the White House press secretary's comments today?
She can say that, but I don't think that the president was ever going to carry that out. Yet, I think it was another flaw in their strategy, because I'm not sure that that's what was persuasive with the Iranians. It certainly has a lot of fallout with diplomats around the world, not only among our allies, but also our adversaries. It just seemed, according to people I spoke to, unpresidential. The profanity that he used on Easter Sunday was shocking to a lot of people. It seemed desperate, and it didn't seem to show that he had a real command of the situation, that he was so eager to find a way out of it. And it's just the kind of threat to say that you're going to eliminate a civilization. Even the threat of that is a violation of Article 51 of the Geneva Conventions. You don't have to do it. Obviously, far worse if you do it. And you can argue that there are dual-use issues with railroads and other facilities that are civilian facilities, but it's still so far beyond the realm of the way people negotiate. And it just seemed to me that it was exposing the weakness of the American position and the fact that the Iranians had so much leverage over the Strait of Hormuz. The Strait of Hormuz was open. It was international waters before the war. And now there's an enormous distance between the two sides as to who is monitoring it, who has control, and whether tolls are going to be exacted by one or both of the parties. So it's not an open waterway any longer.
Yeah, I also want to talk about the NATO chief, Mark Rutte. He's meeting with President Trump this afternoon. Ken, how much damage has this war done to the NATO alliance and the relationship with some of our allies like France and the UK?
Well, so I certainly think, Melanie, it's done a tremendous amount of damage as long as Trump is president, right? This has simply reinforced trends that they've been seeing going back to his first term in office, where he has been contemptuous of NATO. He has repeatedly made clear that he doesn't care about NATO, that he is not committed to NATO's defense. Obviously, none of that plays very well with NATO. This time around, I think that it has gotten worse because, of course, he took the United States to war in a way that NATO didn't appreciate, that was very dangerous for the European members of NATO, and then turned around after he created all these problems with global energy, demanding that NATO suddenly respond. And truth be told, NATO's ability to respond was always going to be limited. They just don't have the military capabilities that we do. He then reacted very badly to them. I think the biggest questions right now, though, Melanie, are first, what does President Trump do after this with regard to NATO? Does he, in a fit of pique, further distance the United States? Congress has made it so that he can't actually pull us out of the alliance, but he can certainly do further damage to demonstrate his anger at the European members of NATO. And then how does NATO respond even after President Trump leaves office? Do they look at this as a sign of a bigger set of problems with American unreliability, or do they say, well, that was just Trump, and whoever comes next will go back to the old way things were?
Yeah, we'll certainly be watching very closely to see President Trump's tone when it comes to NATO. Andrea, I want to ask about the topic of Lebanon. We were talking about it earlier in the show. Israel continues to bomb Lebanon. What is Netanyahu's endgame here?
It's really unclear because Netanyahu is going after Hezbollah. Hezbollah is part of the parliament. It's part of the system in Lebanon. But this government in Lebanon has been trying to control it and to limit their power. Israel had already done a lot to get rid of their weapons, and they are a threat to northern Israel. They have been firing against northern Israel. They are a proxy of Iran. But there's a way of doing it, even if they are taking land and creating a DMZ, if you will. They've been bombing Beirut. 1.2 million people are displaced. And the Arab allies are saying, just stop bombing Beirut. We're going to have to, the Saudis and others, we're going to have to come in and rebuild that as well as Gaza. I mean, what are you doing here? It's also destabilizing Syria next door, which is a fledgling country. So it is, but the U.S. and Israel both say that Lebanon was not part of the ceasefire. Iran and Pakistan say it is. So there's another disagreement.
Another disagreement. Andrea, Ken, thank you so much both for your important perspectives.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.